Paying someone to do something they already love doing can make them stop loving it. Not eventually. Often within weeks. This is the overjustification effect, one of the strangest, most counterintuitive findings in motivation research. It says adding a reward on top of genuine interest does not stack the two together. It replaces one with the other, and most managers design incentive programs without ever suspecting this is possible. The clearest demonstration comes from a classic 1973 study by psychologists Mark Lepper, David Green, and Richard Nisbett, often referred to as the undermining experiment, because it undermined an assumption almost everyone in psychology held at the time. Standard behaviorist thinking said rewards reinforce behavior. Full stop. The more reward you add, the more behavior you get. Lepper, Green, and Nisbett suspected that assumption broke down once genuine interest was already present before the reward showed up. They built an experiment simple enough that a classroom of preschoolers could run it without knowing they were part of anything at all. They worked with children who already spent real chunks of their free playtime drawing with felt-tip markers, purely because they enjoyed it. Nobody forced them, nobody paid them. Drawing sat alongside blocks and dress-up and running around outside as just another thing kids did because it was fun, full stop, with no adult attaching any significance to it whatsoever. The researchers split the children into 3 groups. The first group was told in advance that if they drew, they would receive a certificate for drawing, an official-looking piece of recognition with their name on it, presented as something worth having. The second group drew with no reward mentioned at all, exactly as they always had, markers left out, the way markers are always left out. The third group was not told anything beforehand, but afterward, unprompted, received the very same certificate as a surprise, unearned and unannounced, arriving after the drawing was already finished. Weeks later, with the experiment seemingly long forgotten by the children, the researchers quietly observed the same 3 groups during ordinary free play. Markers were available. No reward was on the table, no mention of certificates, nothing. What they found was not a small or borderline effect. The children who had been promised the certificate in advance drew noticeably less than before, spending measurably less of their free time at the marker table than they had prior to the study. Their interest had genuinely dropped, not just their willingness to perform for an audience. The other 2 groups, the one with no reward at all and the one with a surprise reward, kept drawing at roughly their earlier level, and some children in those groups drew even more than before. The difference was not the certificate itself, since 2 of the 3 groups eventually received identical certificates. The difference was the sequence. Promising a reward before an activity changes what the activity means to the person doing it. A reward that shows up afterward, as a surprise, does not do the same damage because it never gave the child a chance to reinterpret their own motivation while the behavior was still happening. So why does announcing a reward in advance do so much damage when a surprise reward barely touches anything? And why did this contradict what behaviorist theory predicted? The leading explanation is self-perception theory, developed by psychologist Darrell Bem. The theory argues that people frequently do not have direct, privileged access to their own internal motives, contrary to how it feels from the inside. Instead, people infer why they did something by observing their own behavior and the circumstances surrounding it, essentially the same way an outside observer would, watching from across the room with no more information than what is visible. If a child draws while a certificate is dangling in front of them as the reason to draw, the mind quietly files the behavior under, "I did this for the certificate." If a child draws with nothing on offer, the mind files the same behavior under, "I did this because I wanted to." The certificate is not just a reward sitting next to the activity. It becomes the explanation for the activity, and once the explanation shifts from "I want to" "I was paid to," the certificate becomes load-bearing. Remove it, and the entire structure of motivation the person built around it collapses with it. This connects to the broader, well-established distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is doing something because the activity itself is satisfying, interesting, or meaningful on its own terms. Extrinsic motivation is doing something because of an outcome separate from the activity, a paycheck, a prize, a certificate, a leaderboard position. Self-determination theory, developed by psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, adds a further layer, arguing that intrinsic motivation depends heavily on a felt sense of autonomy, competence, and relatedness on acting because you genuinely chose to, not because you were told to or paid to. An external reward introduced before the fact can quietly puncture that sense of autonomy without anyone noticing it happening. The activity stops feeling like something you do for yourself and starts feeling like something you are doing for someone else, on someone else's terms, measured by someone else's yardstick. Once that shift happens, take the reward away, and there is often nothing left underneath it to sustain the behavior. Here is the uncomfortable part most incentive designers never sit with, and it is the one original claim worth pausing on. They assume motivation is additive, that stacking a reward on top of existing enthusiasm can only add fuel to a fire that is already burning. The evidence says it behaves more like a seesaw instead. Push down on the extrinsic side, and the intrinsic side quietly lifts up and off the board, often so gradually that nobody notices until the enthusiasm is simply gone and nobody can explain when it left. This exact mechanism shows up constantly at work, usually disguised as good management, wrapped in language about recognition and appreciation. Take an employee who has always enjoyed mentoring junior colleagues, answering questions after hours, walking someone through a tricky problem, because it feels good to watch someone else improve under their guidance. The company introduces a formal mentoring bonus, paid per logged session, meant sincerely as a thank you for unpaid labor that was going unnoticed. Within a few months, the mentoring often continues at a similar frequency, but something about its texture changes. The employee starts logging sessions, checking whether a given conversation technically qualifies for payment, mentally converting what used to be an instinctive favor into a line item on a form. The relationship that used to run purely on generosity now runs partly on accounting, and accounting has a way of crowding out generosity even when the money involved is modest. The same pattern shows up in teams built around creative problem solving. A group of engineers who used to stay late arguing over an elegant fix, purely because cracking the puzzle together was satisfying in itself, gets told that the best idea in the next sprint wins a cash prize, framed as a fun incentive to boost engagement. Participation might spike for a week or two, but the texture of the conversation changes underneath the surface. People start pitching ideas strategically instead of transparently, holding back their best thinking until it can be attributed to them individually rather than shared early, treating colleagues as competitors instead of collaborators working toward the same goal. The prize reframes the entire activity from "we are solving something hard together, and that is satisfying," to "I am competing for a payout," and the joint curiosity that used to drive the team quietly evaporates, even though, on paper, participation numbers might look identical or even improved. But here's the part nobody expects. This effect is not limited to money that arrives as an obvious headline reward. It shows up wherever an authentic activity gets formally monetized, gamified, or tracked, even when the amounts involved are small or the mechanism is dressed up as playful and fun. Take internal hackathons. Many companies run them specifically to harness the genuine curiosity engineers already have about hard technical problems, the same kind of curiosity that drives people to build side projects for free on a Saturday afternoon, for no reason except that it is interesting. Add a meaningful cash prize for the winning team, and the event frequently gets more competitive, not more creative, which is the opposite of what the prize was meant to produce. Teams start optimizing for whatever criteria the judges will reward, rather than for what genuinely interests them as engineers. People who would normally chase an unusual, high-risk idea purely because it is fascinating, instead chase the safer idea that is more likely to place, because now there is a specific, monetized outcome worth protecting. The prize does not amplify the curiosity that made hackathons appealing to engineers in the first place. It quietly redirects that curiosity toward defending the reward instead. Employee referral bonuses tell a similar story in a slightly different register. Many employees genuinely enjoy recommending their company to friends when they truly believe in the place. The same instinctive way people recommend a good restaurant or a good doctor, with nothing to gain except the satisfaction of a good recommendation landing well. Introduce a referral bonus, say a meaningful payment for every hire who lasts past a probationary period, and the recommendation itself starts to change in tone, even if the underlying belief in the company hasn't changed at all. Employees begin pitching the job with the practiced enthusiasm of someone selling something, because now, in a very literal sense, they are selling something, with a commission attached to the outcome. Friends on the receiving end can often sense the difference between "you would genuinely love it here" and "you would love it here," and also "I get paid if you take the job." The bonus does not simply add an incentive on top of genuine advocacy. For a meaningful share of employees, it quietly converts a personal recommendation into a sales pitch, and sales pitches are trusted less than honest opinions, which happens to be exactly the currency referral programs depend on to work in the first place. Gamified recognition programs run into a version of the same trap, on the softer end of the spectrum. Some companies replace informal, spontaneous appreciation, a colleague publicly thanking a teammate for staying late to help them hit a deadline, with a points-based system. Log the help, earn badges, redeem accumulated points for gift cards or merchandise. The stated goal is usually to make recognition more consistent, more visible, and more equitably distributed across a large organization. What often happens instead is that recognition becomes something people track and optimize, rather than something people feel and freely express. A thank you that used to be spontaneous becomes a transaction logged for points, timed for maximum badge value, and colleagues can often sense when appreciation is being performed for the system's scoreboard, rather than felt sincerely for them as a person. The platform did not manufacture more genuine appreciation across the company. It gave people a formal, external reason to perform appreciation, which is a fundamentally different thing, and usually a weaker one, even though the dashboard metrics might report more recognition events than ever. There is a broader organizational cost to all of this that rarely shows up until much later. Once employees learn, even unconsciously, that a company tends to attach a price tag to things they used to do out of genuine interest, they start preemptively guarding their own enthusiasm. People become more reluctant to visibly enjoy their work, because visible enjoyment is exactly the signal that invites the next well-meaning incentive program. Some employees start deliberately downplaying how much they like mentoring, or brainstorming, or helping a colleague, specifically to avoid having that enjoyment turned into a metric, a bonus tier, or a leaderboard. That is a strange and quietly corrosive outcome for a program that was designed with entirely good intentions, and it rarely gets traced back to its actual cause, because the incentive program itself usually looks successful on paper, right up until the underlying enthusiasm it was supposed to reward has already quietly disappeared. None of this means incentives are bad management, and it would be a mistake to walk away thinking rewards should be avoided altogether. It means incentives are directional, and the direction they push depends entirely on what already existed in a person's motivation before the reward showed up. The rule that actually holds up in practice is simple to state, even if it is uncomfortable to apply. Incentives are safe, even essential, for activities people do not already intrinsically enjoy. Nobody has deep intrinsic love for data entry, expense report reconciliation, cold outreach quotas, or repetitive compliance checklists that exist purely because a regulator requires them. These tasks have little existing internal motivation sitting there to crowd out in the first place, so a bonus, a commission structure, or a point system adds motivation rather than quietly replacing something that was already there for free. There is no seesaw to tip in the wrong direction because nothing of value was sitting on the intrinsic side of the board to begin with. Incentives get risky the moment they attach to something people already do for its own sake. Creative problem solving, mentoring, genuine collaboration, honest advocacy for a place they believe in, mastery of a craft they take pride in. These are precisely the activities where a well-meaning company is most tempted to formally reward good behavior in order to encourage more of it, and precisely where that instinct is most likely to backfire because the reward does not add to existing enthusiasm so much as it explains the enthusiasm away, replacing an internal story with an external one. Before formalizing any incentive, it is worth asking one plain practical question. Would people already be doing this if no reward existed at all? If the honest answer is yes, introducing a pre-announced, formal reward is far more likely to shrink the behavior over time than to strengthen it, no matter how generous the reward looks on paper. That does not mean genuine effort should go permanently unacknowledged, and there is an important asymmetry worth holding on to here. The overjustification effect is specifically about rewards promised in advance for something a person already loved doing before the reward existed. A surprise, after-the-fact recognition, a bonus nobody was expecting, a public thank you with no rulebook or point system behind it does not carry the same risk, because it never gave the person a reason to reattribute their own motivation while the behavior was still in progress. The safest kind of recognition preserves some ambiguity about why someone acted in the moment, so the internal explanation stays, "I wanted to," rather than quietly curdling into "I was paid to." The practical takeaway for anyone designing incentives at work is this: save formal, pre-announced rewards for tasks people would otherwise actively avoid, and be deliberate, even cautious, about attaching them to work people already do out of genuine interest. If you want to reinforce mentoring, creative thinking, or honest advocacy for your organization, protect the autonomy and meaning that already exist there rather than pricing them. Recognize the behavior after the fact as a surprise instead of announcing a reward for it in advance. Once you put a price tag on something someone loved doing for free, you may discover the love was the more valuable asset all along, and it rarely comes back on its own just because you quietly remove the price tag later. Hit follow if that surprised you.